They didn't say, what can we do to help everyone? But they said, what can we do at least to help the children?
The Holocaust is rightly remembered as one of the biggest atrocities in human history. And while many are familiar with the horrors of the Holocaust, few are familiar with the rescue mission to save Jewish children known as the Kindertransports. In 1996, Melissa Hacker, a U.S. filmmaker who received a Fulbright grant to Austria in 2010, released her debut documentary and the first documentary to ever be made about the Kindertransports, entitled My Knees Were Jumping: Remembering the Kindertransports. Though her documentary was released nearly 30 years ago, it has only been shown in Austria twice. When Melissa came to Vienna in January 2025 for the second screening, we sat down with her to talk about her first documentary and her recent project about the Kindertransports.
In the 9 months before World War II, when families were trying to get out of Nazi Germany and Austria, which at that point was not Austria, but part of Greater Germany, when whole families couldn't get out, there arose the possibility to send children out without their parents. After November 9th, 1938, in Great Britain, people in Parliament and elsewhere said, things are terrible in Germany. What can we do? They didn't say, what can we do to help everyone? But they said, what can we do at least to help the children? So there are debates in Parliament that you can read online that they talk about whether to bring children to Britain, because a big issue back then, before the war started, was that no country would take penniless Jewish refugees. So Britain made an exception to take in children. And so the first Kindertransport left Germany on December 1st, 1938. The first Kindertransport left Vienna on December 10th, 1938. And they ran until the start of the war on September 1st, 1939, and took nearly 10,000 children without their parents to safety in the United Kingdom, where they lived in foster homes and schools and hostels. And most of them never saw their parents again. In addition to the Kindertransports to the United Kingdom, there were Kindertransports in much smaller numbers to Sweden, Switzerland, the Netherlands, France, where they then, when France was occupied, had to go south and south and south, and eventually 1,000 went to the US. Growing up, I grew up in New York, and I knew my mother was different. She was different from other American mothers. She had an accent, which was a combination of an Austrian accent and a British accent, and she had fears. She was afraid of crowds. She was afraid of people in uniform. For example, I never thought, as many of my white friends did, that police were our friends. They were always a danger. But I didn't know details. My mother spoke German, and she didn't want us to speak German because she had experienced so much pain in that language. I knew she had left as a child from Vienna, but I didn't know that other children had gone also. So it wasn't until I went to college, I dropped out of college, I didn't know what I was doing, and then went back to college and was studying with George Stoney, who was a brilliant documentary filmmaker and professor. And I thought I would make a short film about my mother because she had a really interesting career as well as a past I knew nothing about. And then because I was working on a film, so it wasn't just me saying, Mom, tell me about your life, because it was something separate and because she was really proud that I had found something I could maybe make a career of, she answered questions that I asked. And then, only then, I found out that she was not the only child who was sent alone out of Vienna as a child in the months before World War II. I found out that she was part of this larger rescue movement called the Kindertransports. And at that point, no one that I spoke to in New York had ever heard of the Kindertransports. So I knew this was an unknown story of the Holocaust, a story of rescue, a story of people taking action to save lives. And also, the first question people asked me was, why did the Nazis let the children leave? And I had to explain, well, getting Jews out of Germany was the Nazi goal. They had to get various papers and approval, and they couldn't take money. But the catch was that no country would take them. So I really wanted people to understand that too, that the US also has involvement in this. In 1939, after the Kindertransports had been running successfully to the United Kingdom for 2 months, there was a bipartisan bill, the Wagner-Rogers bill, brought up to Congress to allow up to 20,000 unaccompanied children to come to the US. And that bill was killed in committee. People campaigned, child welfare officials, even Mary Pickford and other people spoke at hearings all over the country, but it didn't even make it to the floor. So I really wanted to tell this unknown story. So my first film, My Knees Were Jumping, Remembering the Kindertransports, was the first film made on the Kindertransports. And it was my first film, and I had no idea what I was doing. I took a long time to make it because it was an unknown subject and an unknown filmmaker. And among other things, raising money was really difficult. And also, I have to admit, I love doing it. I was really happy to do it, and I had no idea that I would then have to show it to people and get it out in the world. So it premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and was broadcast all over the world. And I traveled. I had no idea this would happen. I traveled all over for about a year. However, it didn't show in Vienna. And the rumor that I heard was that it was because it tells the story of the Kindertransports, but it also shows how the survivors are still affected by it and the second generation is still affected by it. And what I heard was that if it just told the story of the Kindertransports, it would have been better received in Vienna because it was at a time when Vienna was not fully facing the role of Austria in the Holocaust. So it has not shown, it's only shown publicly in Vienna once before in 2017. And I have to say, it still shows. I still get requests to screen it. It just showed in Pittsburgh, in the school system in November. So it's not so much a revisiting in that it's amazing. It's a film that has such legs. I never imagined it would still be showing this many years later. But Karen Hunter organized an exhibit on Laurie Siegel at the 8th District Museum called I Wanted to Love Vienna, but I couldn't. And Laurie escaped Vienna on a Kindertransport at age 10. And I've known Laurie for many years. She and her mother and her 2 children, 3 generations of Laurie Siegel, are in my film. So Karen reached out to me and asked if there was any way we could bring the film to Vienna in conjunction with the exhibit. So the film has mostly been received really well. The first time it showed in San Francisco at the Castro Theater, which is this big old Art Deco theater with an organ that goes down. The first person who asked a question after the film was this survivor who got up and said, I survived 3 concentration camps and I panicked because I thought she was going to say, and why did you make a film about the Kindertransports? Nothing happened to them. They aren't survivors. Because while making the film, I had heard that criticism that the Kindertransport children weren't really survivors. Nothing really happened to them. Why look at them? Which was a reason I wanted to make the film, because they themselves felt so much that they were the lucky ones. They had such survivor's guilt that nothing happened to them. But of course, many things happened to them. They saw things no child should see, and they were separated from their parents. But she got up and said, I was in 3 concentration camps and I never heard of the Kindertransports. Thank you for making this. I learned so much. So that's been most of the reception that I've gotten. And I really enjoy talking to people afterwards. I mean, one of the things I wanted the film to be used for was to people to look at their own families. For example, a friend of mine saw it when it premiered in Los Angeles, and she was then married to a Chinese poet. And she brought Yibing to the screening, and she said, oh, he's just coming to support us. He's not going to be interested. At a certain point, I hear this rustling next to me, and he's weeping. And he realized that his parents had suffered so much during the Cultural Revolution in China, and he'd never talked to them about it. And after seeing the film, he wanted to talk to them about it. So really, so many families of immigrants, refugees, and who've gone through other traumas have this transmission of generational trauma or even just hidden stories and secrets. And I wanted the film to be used to open up conversations between the generations. "256,000 Miles from Home" is a new 15-minute short that I made following an 80th year commemorative trip that was taken by 4 Kindertransport survivors and 14 members of the second generation. And I focus on the 4 Kindertransport survivors. And I have to say, I didn't want to make another film about the Kindertransports. I did this already. But the trip was so evocative, and going on it with them, you could see how they were sometimes mixing past and present and what it meant to them. One of them from Graz was a toddler when his parents put him on a Kindertransport, and he wanted to feel, he had no memories of what that trip was like, and he wanted to feel what it was like and see if he could somehow understand even what his parents felt to put him as a toddler on this train. And Ilse is from Vienna, and Eva also from Vienna, and Ralph is from Wolfhagen, and Mark from Graz. It was going with them on this trip and watching them sort of filter their memories. Ralph spoke in Parliament in Berlin and made everyone, including me, cry. Although I resisted making this film, it ended up being a really beautiful experience, and I think it is a really lovely short film that can be used in education and in conferences. And it's called 256,000 Miles from Home because Ralph worked for NASA for 20 years. And after going to high school twice, which he complains about in the film, because he went to high school in England and they need to redo it in America, but he ended up going to graduate school and working for NASA and being involved with a telescope for the first moon landing. And when we were in Harwich, we stopped, which is where the ferries carrying the children landed in the UK. We stopped and he spoke to a class of school children, and he discovered that they were studying the moon. And so he thought, what can I talk about that we can relate to each other? And since he was involved with NASA, he started talking to them about the moon and how many miles away from Earth is the moon. And it's 256,000 miles away. And I love that as also a metaphor for the children who are being sent on the Kindertransports, going out into space, going out so far from their parents without knowing where they were going, and the parents not knowing who was going to take care of their children and if they would ever see them again.